Now, for a more in-depth analysis of today's events, we are now joined in studio by Wits Economic and Business Sciences lecturer Tinashe Chuchu and Professor Raymond Parsons from the Northwest University School of Business and Governance. Prof, Tinashe, thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening.
Thank you for having us.
Now, Prof, we've heard what our U.S. correspondent has said. We've seen what Trump has said in his speech. Can we just go into that? More of a campaign speech than an inaugural speech?
Well, yes, I think that was vintage Trump, and I think we're going to have to get used to that now. He wrote the speech himself, I think, largely, and it certainly bore his imprint. I think the message, the overall message to all of us, whether you're in America or elsewhere, you've got to get ready for Trump's world. It's his world now that he's defined. And while being in government as opposed to campaigning may place some constraints on him as to what he can actually do, I think we've got to understand that we are still in uncharted waters as to exactly what he will do, what he'll be able to do. But he's not going to change. I mean, his core message is the same. There are certain important things he wants to do. And I think we all then have to decide when we look at the American situation, what is the risk that our best forecasts will turn out to be wrong? Because we are in these uncharted waters. So it is very much vintage Trump, where he put his stamp on what he said. And I think in terms of American politics, as I think several commentators have said, he hasn't tried to reach across the aisle in any way. And we must understand that unlike our political system or the British political system, although he has a Republican majority in Congress, it's not a tame majority. And so some of the things he wants to do, he will have to persuade his Republican colleagues to, in fact, go along with it. I think what you're going to see now, his first 100 days are much more important than the last 100 days. And what he's going to do in the first 100 days, just remember there are two mechanisms. The one is, of course, these executive orders that a president can sign. I think we're going to see a flurry of activity where he will be able to issue executive orders of certain kind, and up to a point also reversing some of the decisions which his predecessor has taken. So I think that's the one message he'll want to get over. The second will be, what kind of legislation can he get through the Congress? What will be his priorities? Will they be on the economic front? Will it be on the social front? For example, the question of Obamacare, will that be at the top of the list? So I think the next 100 days are going to be very interesting for all of us to see what happens in the States.
Now, Tinashe, Prof has gone through a lot of things, and I think for me the most interesting part is his theme of vintage Trump. We spoke about this about a week ago when you were here, where we said, analysts, some analysts had said that, Trump is just saying this for the campaign, and once he becomes president, it'll be a whole different story. But his speech is saying he's going to stick to his guns, and he's going to stick to what he had said during the campaign trail. What can we expect as Africans? Let's go into that, because I think that's the most important thing. We sat and we watched as Africans and we wondered, what does that mean for us?
Okay, I think that's a good question. What I can say is, first of all, as Africans, we should not necessarily expect much, because we might be disappointed. And at the same time, we also have to appreciate that he got elected because someone in Pennsylvania felt his message resonated with him, not necessarily us. But I think that because he really wants to invest a lot into infrastructure, that might create demand for raw materials. And he also wants to hike the tariff from 20% to 35% for China and Mexico, which means that it will become more difficult for China to do trade with the US, which also benefits South Africa indirectly, because smaller states like South Africa are able to compete if it's harder for larger powers like China to compete. So I think we should be modest in terms of our expectations.
But I think I would add, we may be modest, but we must also be prudent. because there are two levels at which we could be affected. The first is, as has been indicated, whatever steps he might take in the field of for example, infrastructure, or in fact government spending on that kind of infrastructure, or the tax cuts, and so forth, if that stimulates further the US economy, that will be good for commodities and so forth. But on the other hand, if it causes inflation, it would then get, of course, the Federal Reserve to say, well, it's time for us to put up interest rates a little further, or the dollar may strengthen further, and that will have implications for a lot of emerging markets like South Africa, which is particularly dependent on short-term capital. And once you find that these interest rate differentials change, that money could move out. That's the one aspect. The other aspect is the trade aspect. Now, several of his advisors have cautioned that they're not happy with what they call asymmetrical trade pacts, where you are benefiting other countries, as they see it, at the expense of America. Well, if you look at AGOA, that is very much one of those, because it's designed to assist the continent of Africa. I'm hoping we can keep it below the radar, that there are other priorities, even on the trade front. Most of the debate has been about Europe, about China, and so forth, and about Mexico. Hopefully, we will fall below the radar, and it won't be something that we need to worry about. But we just need to be prudent and make sure that whatever happens, whatever new uncertainties may or may not arise, and however much there is some rhetoric that we still want to have good trade relations with the United States, which we certainly do, I think it will be important for us just to make sure that what we need to do domestically keeps our house in order, so that we're not vulnerable to any new shocks.
Now, Prof, just to move away from that very quickly, we will come back to this more economic discussion and what Trump's era will mean for Africa and the rest of the world. We just had visuals of the protests taking place currently as the inauguration was taking place, where people are protesting and not happy with the inauguration. What does this really mean? Because the decision has been made, it's final, the inauguration has taken place, it's sealed, it's signed. Can anything change from this?
Well, also maybe just before you answer, let's also speak on the unity message that Barack spoke about, as well as Hillary Clinton. We heard our correspondent there saying that Hillary Clinton tweeted that the reason why she's there is for the democracy and the unity of the American people. So just take us through that.
Those are very important values for any democracy, but especially for the United States over many decades. And indeed, you will see it implicit in the founding fathers of the United States and why they created the sort of constitution that they have. But we've got to understand there's a businessman in the White House. And we've got to understand that. And certain things will flow from that, and certain things he will learn as he goes along, that this is not like Trump Towers. This is the White House, and as his own predecessors will in fact tell him, you will find you can't do exactly as you like. The second point is, I think if there are elections, I mean, in many countries there are people who don't like the outcome of the election, even when it's a fair election, let alone when it's an unfair election. So I think, and another point one has to bear in mind, when one talks about how big is the mandate. Now, I'm sure that some other constitutional expert will explain this, but we must understand that because of the electoral college system, which is a very peculiar system they have, although it was Hillary Clinton who probably got the highest popular vote ever, the fact was that a mere 80,000 votes spread over 3 states swung those votes in the electoral college. That doesn't in any way say that his win wasn't a mandate or was not legitimate, but it means that there's a large chunk of the population to whom he must also reach out and show that he's now the president of the whole country and not just those who in fact put him into power. And I think that's the big challenge. But I think once again we've got to accept that he is absolutely a unique personality in terms of the sort of people who've been in the White House. He's even in some way quite a unique business person. And now we're going to see whether he can reconcile the skills of profit making with the
Prof,
skills
let's come in there.
and policy making.
Let's look at those visuals right now. I mean, as you can see, we've been speaking about this. This is breaking news where the anti-Trump protest is continuing, but it's getting more and more volatile, it seems. I think during the day we saw people marching. It was a little bit more peaceful where people were just holding placards, but now it's getting more and more volatile. Can we expect to see more of this as we see now on those visuals?
I think this was expected because, like what Prof was saying, I feel that if you win the electoral college vote but lose the popular vote by 2 million, it means that there are going to be so many people who are disgruntled. Because, for instance, Hillary Clinton had 10 million votes. That didn't matter. I'm sorry to say this, but she got a lot of votes in Texas, a state she had no chance of winning. She got a lot of votes in a lot of these purple states that actually really didn't matter. So I think that there are going to be a lot of protests, and it's going to be a huge task for President Trump to unite the nation.
Prof, is this new in the United States in terms of people protesting at this level against a sitting president? Because that's what it is now, essentially.
Those of us who've been around a little longer will recall that, for example, if you take the Vietnam War and under Nixon, there were huge reactions about his policies on Vietnam, and it led to a lot of serious consequences. And indeed, if you look at American history, yes, there are times when there's been a cycle of reaction on some issue, whether it's to do with who's been elected or whether that person who's been elected is following certain policies which have suddenly become highly unpopular. And I would simply say here, while I admire the commitments which President Trump has now outlined very clearly in his inaugural address, the fact he's set himself up here because he's offered a huge promissory note which is going to fall due in the next couple of years.
And that's something we want to chat about some more, definitely.
Definitely, but we have to take a short break. We will continue the discussion with Professor Parsons and Business and Science lecturer Tinashe Chuchu after the break. Stay with us.
Failure to implement the water restriction is going to make the system not workable. For the domestic use, everyone should not exceed 25 kiloliters per day.
What is the penalty and how much have you raked in thus far as a municipality?
For domestic users, if they exceed 25 kiloliters, then they're going to be charged a penalty on their monthly bill. And so far already we've collected 1.7 million.
The 200 million rand state-of-the-art school in Magaliesburg had been vandalized by drug addicts. How bad is it?
It's very bad. Into the hostel residents, it was even worse because there the doors, the wardrobes, the beds, the ceiling were broken down. Showers were ripped off, and it couldn't be used by students who are actually using that particular boarding facility.
Welcome back. We continue with our rolling coverage of the inauguration of Donald Trump as the 45th President of the United States.
Trump in his address earlier pointed to the exploitation of American workers and promised that such a situation will cease under his rule.
For many decades, we've enriched foreign industry at the expense of American industry, subsidize the armies of other countries while allowing for the very sad depletion of our military. We've defended other nations' borders while refusing to defend our own. And spent trillions and trillions of dollars overseas, while America's infrastructure has fallen into disrepair and decay. We've made other countries rich, while the wealth, strength, and confidence of our country has dissipated over the horizon. One by one, the factories shuttered and left our shores, with not even a thought about the millions and millions of American workers that were left behind. The wealth of our middle class has been ripped from their homes and then redistributed all across the world. But that is the past, and now we are looking only to the future.
We continue with our discussion in studio with Wits Economic and Business Science lecturer Tinashe Chuchu and Professor Raymond Parsons from the Northwest University School of Business and Governance.
Thank you for joining us again, gentlemen. Now, Prof, something we were speaking about during the ad break, and I have to bring it in, is that element of Donald Trump being a businessman. We can't forget that. And an interesting thing that we were discussing was the fact that he hasn't been a great businessman throughout, for example, but it seems like he's trying to run the White House as though it's a business. That must be disastrous.
Well, look, I think one wants to say that if you look at his business career, he's had ups and downs. He's had successes and failures, but recently he was riding a very good wave from a business point of view, and hence was able to find the time to go into politics. And against the odds, we must remember, against the odds, he's ended up in the White House. One must hope, in parenthesis, that he doesn't sell the White House while he's there, being a property magnate. But the fact is that I think that it doesn't mean that a business person cannot succeed in politics, but it's unusual. I mean, you, for example, had someone like Mitt Romney, who was a successful business person, but it's not something that happens every day, because the skills, as I said, are different, and the skills of money making and the skills of policy making are seldom vested in the same person. But there are exceptions. So we'll have to see how he accommodates himself. There are going to be two steep learning curves for him and for those who have to work with him.
Now, just looking at that, Prof, let's touch on the issue of him bringing his son-in-law and his daughter coming into play as advisors and policy strategists. Is this not sort of going to work against him at some point in time, where he's bringing family into a family business? Is this what he's trying to set up?
I think what will happen is everywhere you look, there are going to be conflicts of interest. We can even start from the transition. You'll find that Jared Kushner was being accused of being the person who got Governor Chris Christie removed from the transition team. And if you look back, Chris Christie was responsible for arresting Jared Kushner's father. So I think you can't have high national security clearance for your son-in-law, who's also a competitive businessman. And at the same time, he said the Trump organization is going to be in a so-called blind trust. But if you have your two sons running that blind trust, I don't think it's still blind. And on top of that, there is the Trump Hotel in Pennsylvania Avenue. The person who's responsible for receiving rentals for that hotel is a presidential appointee. It's like he's going to be negotiating rent with himself.
So it's almost conflict on interest over conflict of interest.
I think these issues, which could become very contentious, of course, really revolve around two levels. The first is what is legally permissible in terms of the Constitution and the existing American law, which lays down what are the ethics that have to be followed by someone who is either the president or occupies a high office. In certain instances, the president is exempt from certain of these constraints. That's point number one. And the second one is simply the question of appearances. Is it morally or ethically the right thing to do, irrespective of what the law says? So I think those two factors will determine whether this is going to become a moral and legal quagmire over the next couple of years, or whether it can be managed in a way that that appears to be reasonable, even if not entirely acceptable.
I think maybe that would take us back to the discussion we had about the shoes that he has to fill, because there will always be comparison between him and Barack Obama. We saw the kind of man that Barack Obama was. He wasn't involved in business. He wasn't, I mean, and he, you know, his wife stood her own, for example, and you've got people already comparing the two wives, for example. So you're constantly going to see that. Take us through that comparison that we keep seeing over and over again.
Yes, I think it's important to say that there is no way we can talk about Donald Trump without talking about Obama's legacy.
Of course.
And Obama's signature move, if you had to call it a move, was to sign the Affordable Health Care Act.
Yes.
And what will happen is historians are going to judge Trump on how he's going to repeal and replace it. But I think it's important to appreciate that in theory, it's easy to repeal and replace it because he has Congress, he has the White House, and on top of that, he's going to appoint a conservative Supreme Court judge. So it means that maybe for the next 2 decades, Supreme Court decisions are going to be right-leaning. My point is, how Trump handles the Affordable Health Care Act could be part of how people will compare him to Barack Obama. Yes.
Now, we just going back to what Professor Parsons had said earlier, the fact that when he speaks, when Trump speaks, there's a bit of exaggeration in how he says things and his delivery, because he's looking for a certain reaction from the American people. Will this not work against him, especially looking at that Obamacare, which it's called, in terms of how it's going to be filtered through and changed? As he says, it just doesn't work for the American people.
I think if we say that maybe he's exaggerating, we can even look at Obama in 2007. He was talking about changing the world, closing Guantanamo Bay. I think as a campaigner, you have to say certain things. That's why maybe a lot of commentators are saying this is no longer the campaign. Now you have to govern. But I think when we look at the Affordable Health Care Act, also known as the Obamacare Act, I think it's important to also appreciate that Trump himself has said there are some elements of this healthcare act that I actually appreciate. Like, for instance, children who are still around, let's say, 26 years can still remain on their parents' plan. He said that's fine with him. But the other aspect of Obamacare that he doesn't like is that what happens is right now people are forced to have healthcare, and if you don't have healthcare, you are penalized for that. On top of that, medical aid companies can't operate across state lines. So what he's trying to do is to open up the market to make it possible for medical aid companies to operate across state lines so that it can be more competitive. He wants to bring in competition. And if you bring in competition, you get a better product. If you get a better product, you lower prices. And because premiums were so high, some people didn't vote for Trump because he said he's going to build a wall. Some people voted for him because their premiums will go down if it's competitive in the healthcare sector.
And I guess that's where the business element.
The important thing here is to understand the whole American process, because to make changes to Obamacare or to replace it or to improve it or whatever you want to do, he's got to work with Congress. This is not an executive order matter. This is something where it will need the compromises that will have to come out of a Congress that also answers to a constituency, which is more divided than the kind of constituency which put him in. So I think it's important to understand that there will have to be, although the drive will be in the direction, a high priority drive will be to ensure that Obamacare is replaced or improved or whatever the options are. It's going to be a process that's going to have to work through the Congress, and the Congress will be very sensitive to any backlash that may occur should they take the wrong decisions in trying to change the Obamacare, because there are people who have gained through it and people who have lost. And that's the new balance you have to strike, and which I think is what Trump and the Congress will be seeking.
Now, with all the things that Trump was saying throughout the campaign trail and all he's tweeting all day, every day, we feel like we know him. But I think we should actually take a look at who Donald Trump really is.
Donald J. Trump, a man with many titles. Long before aspiring for the highest position in office, Donald Trump was America's most famous billionaire. Mr. Trump expressed interest in running for president as early as 1987 and even entered the 2000 race as a Reform Party candidate. Fast forward 30 years later, he is now President of the United States. Donald Trump won a sweeping election victory, setting the world on a journey into the political unknown. The Republican nominee achieved one of the most shocking political victories in modern U.S. history. Skepticism over the Republican's candidacy stemmed not only from his controversial platform on immigration and outrageous campaign style, but from his celebrity past as well. But the 70-year-old businessman had the last laugh when he defied all predictions to beat much more seasoned politicians in the Republican primary race. Under the banner "Make America Great Again," Trump ran a controversial campaign built on promises to strengthen the American economy, build a wall on the border with Mexico and the US, and temporarily ban immigration by Muslims. After Clinton conceded defeat to Trump, the Republican nominee gave his first speech saying, "Now it is time for America to bind the wounds of division, and it is time for us to become together as one united people." Trump also pledged to every citizen of the land that he will be president for all Americans. Until 1933, the new president of the US was inaugurated on March the 4th, 4 months after Election Day. This was then shortened to around 2 months with the ratification of the 20th Amendment. But for today, all eyes will be on Donald J. Trump as he sets forth on the journey as US President.
Being orphaned at an early age propelled him to better heights.
When I was 16, my mother passed away, and I had no choice than to find work, and I had to juggle work between work and school. I've worked on different coffee shops, and eventually in 2012, I started my own business called Sihl's Brew.
Laying good business acumen since childhood nurtured her good standing.
I happened to grow up in a family where my father is a businessman. And as a businessman, he used to have lots of friends from different parts of the world. Business, you need to be committed. You need to live it. You need to love it. You need to be there, at the moment.
For more inspiring stories, stay tuned to Bupilong every Friday.
Welcome back. Various heads of state and delegates attending the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland had this to say about Donald Trump's presidency as uncertainty dominated the last day of the conference.
Coming from the small country, and hope that we'll have a good relationship with US and wish them all the best, and that's the only thing that I can say. But here, if you ask me as just an ordinary guy, I can tell you that the world like turning upside down. Chinese were fulfilling some space that nobody was expecting, and at the same time Americans were leaving some of their positions, or at least it looked like that. And I hope that everything will be okay.
We believe that America will remain a key global actor and a responsible partner in the international relations. As a member of the NATO alliance, we certainly look forward to continue and strengthen our partnership, and I would say attain the same objective when it comes comes to the global stability and the overall economic development.
We're hoping that we'll have a more constructive dialogue on various issues, including situation in Middle East and many other issues. On Syria, well, there are a number of issues. Obviously, Astana process is an important one. And something that has strained Turkey-US relations has been to do with US engagement with P.h.D. YPG, which essentially is an arm of PKK, which is on the US terror list.
We've never had as many unanswered questions, as many open questions, as many risks, the situation, the global situation is dangerous, maybe more dangerous than at any time since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Now, in addition to the crises we had last year, Ukraine, Syria, the South China Seas, North Korea, etc., now we appear to have almost panic in the transatlantic space. Is NATO obsolete or not? Is the European Union something which the US can or should ignore, or is the EU America's most important partner? There is uncertainty, and that must be settled quickly in the interest both of Americans and of Europeans. And I hope that once the inauguration celebrations are over, we will hear from Washington clear and unequivocal statements about what U.S. policy is. In particular, I hope we will hear these statements in Munich in less than 4 weeks' time, when the international foreign policy and security community gets together.
There are some unknowns. I think that our political system has its checks and balances. So I think the president-elect, or now the new president, has made many statements that are controversial to the international community, and somewhat controversial to even the Americans. But I think that he's a man that expresses himself, that puts out ideas, puts out philosophies, tweets. But in the end, he's a businessman. He knows he knows general direction. He knows what he wants to accomplish, and I think that it will be interesting to see where he goes from here. Personally, I didn't vote for him, but I'm optimistic.
We are still with our guests, Wits Economic and Business Sciences lecturer Tinashe Chuchu and Professor Raymond Parsons from the Northwest University School of Business and Governance.
Gentlemen, we were having a discussion while the clip was while we were at break and the clip was playing. Just coming back to what a lot of the leaders were saying who were at Davos in Switzerland, a lot of sentiment towards continued relations with America, continued partnerships with America. Everyone seems uncertain, and they're hoping that Donald Trump will come out and say, listen, we're not going to make drastic changes. Yes, I've mentioned it, I've spoken about it, America first, but let's sit down and have a discussion and then see how we take this forward. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think if you start at the beginning of that meeting in Davos, the IMF did issue a report on the outlook for the world economy, which was very positive. They said there's no change to our previous forecasts. We think the world economy and the different regions will still grow very positively. The world will grow at about 3.5%. And the last few days there was an international survey of world business confidence is the highest it's been since 2008 in the Great Recession. I think what the speakers at Davos are saying, they're looking down the road and saying, well, now, what are the new questions that have arisen since we last met? The world is starting to look very different to what it looked like when we were at Davos 12 months ago. And the big issue is, of course, globalization and the multilateral system, especially through the World Trade Organization and so forth. Not a perfect system, and quite clearly the message is it has not been inclusive enough, and I think that comes out of Davos. But the question then is, do you throw the baby out with the bathwater on behalf of only the United States. And we as South Africa have a stake in the multilateral. It's small countries that want the rules of the game. It's the big countries that think they can ignore the rules of the game. So we have a vested interest in the multilateral system going on, that there are rules that will be enforced. So even if the United States or Mr. Trump decide to do some unilateral things which are unpleasant and harm other countries, you can go and complain to the WTO, but it may take you a couple of years to get the matter resolved. So I think they're hoping that a dialogue with the United States and also some of his cabinet appointees, when they've appeared before Congress now, or at least before the Senate, in order to be approved, I noticed that they've softened some of the stances on trade and certain other issues. So once again, it's a question of whether the new President Trump can achieve what he wants, but that it begin to get softened around the edges by the realities of governance and the realities of the world economy. Because the world economy is not a zero-sum game. It's a place of exchange, and that everyone benefits if there's fair trade.
Tinashe, let's continue with what was said at the World Economic Forum this week. You know, the theme on globalization, but also that very critical one on trade wars. We saw the Chinese president speaking about it, you know, when mentioning the US and obviously President-elect at the time, Donald Trump. Let's look at those possible trade wars that were mentioned at WEF.
Okay, I think let's see if Trump is going to hike that tariff from 20 to 35%, as he promises. And the thing is, what will happen is China can retaliate easily. Most of the products that are found in the US are actually made in China. And if I may just say this, the 2012 Olympic uniform that the US team was wearing, it was made in China. So the thing is, China will say, no, it's fine. You've hiked the tariff, it's fine. We can easily retaliate by looking for other trading partners. But of course, the US is probably the single largest trading partner for any bloc you could think of. So I think that if you have a trade war with China, you're probably going to be on the losing end, because it's a lot cheaper to manufacture products in China. The labor is cheaper, and you find that right now, that's how so many American businesses were surviving. Yes.
Now, just speaking to that and the fact that Trump is now calling for America first, he's calling on American-owned companies who are not based in America to come back to the States and be stateside and develop there and create jobs and you know, improve on unemployment. Prof Parsons, you mentioned the fact that U.S. economy is not doing too badly, sitting at is it 3.3% improvement, and unemployment is sitting at 4%. Just that statement on its own, calling on everyone to return home. China, yes, America is the biggest global partner with the population that they have. What does this mean for the layman who is the immigrant who has moved to the United States to find employment? He's made a lot of statements with regards to Americans must be given first preference. What happens going forward?
Well, you go ahead.
Okay. Whilst you were saying that, I wanted to just jump in to say, because there's protectionist policies, it's going to be hard for immigrants to get that working visa, the US working visa, in the sense that currently what's happening is immigrants are willing to work for less doing the same job, which means that Americans fail to become competitive as labor. So what ends up happening is all these immigrants who work in the US for less, they make money and they send most of that money to their home countries, which means that Americans are not getting employed. At the same time, most of that money is getting out of the States. So I think we might see some shifts in terms of his immigration policy, but I think that campaign rhetoric was on the extreme side, to be honest.
I really think you have to accept that I think we've got to assume that the worst case scenarios, which some people are expecting, will simply not be practicable, because as you go through this process, other checks and balances will kick in, new realities will kick in. That doesn't mean to say there won't be a thrust in certain directions, or that in fact some mistakes may not be made, which may have to be reversed. But we must come back to the point that that there really is no advantage for the world to see the United States and China in a trade war. I mean, it may be true that the smaller countries, as we say here on our continent, when the big elephants fight, the small animals stay out of it. But the fact is that we will also feel the fallout, because the rules of the game will then be suspended, and you don't know who else, where there may be collateral damage to the trade interests of other countries. So I think one's hoping that at the end of the day, yes, the global situation is being reshaped, will be reshaped to some extent, that it will have to be more inclusive. You see, coming back to why are we talking about President Trump, and we talk about Brexit perhaps, why have these things happened? We mustn't just become involved with a personality. There have been forces at work in their societies, whether in the United States or the United Kingdom or in Europe, which have generated these political outcomes. And a large part of it is a feeling that this wonderful globalization, which has lifted millions of people out of poverty, however, has left a lot of people left behind, especially the middle class. And that's been the backlash. And hopefully, when we look at new solutions and new remedies, we'll find a way to do it without destroying the engine of growth and employment in the world as a whole. But quite clearly, what needs to be assessed here is whether President Trump, and through his policies, can make a change that in fact will be a win-win situation and not generate policies which will be a lose-lose situation.
Tinashe, I see you nodding there. We're running out of time, but I know you want to add something, of course.
Was saying.
Yes.
There's no way we can talk about global trade without talking about Rex Tillerson, the nominee for Secretary of State.
Yes.
How is it possible for someone who received the order of friendship from Putin to then say, I think we need to put sanctions on Russia? I think there's going to be massive conflicts of interest regarding Rex Tillerson, in the sense that ExxonMobil has a $500 billion deal with Russia, and he was the chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil at the time. And there is no way he's going to criticize for Russia's actions in, let's say, Ukraine or Syria. And I think in terms of the global scene, it's going to be interesting how Rex Tillerson is going to act as Secretary of State, because in my own knowledge, he's probably the first Secretary of State who actually wasn't in government.
It seems like this is going to be
I think
very
the important
interesting
point here for all of us, if we're now in the last lap of our discussion, is, I said at the beginning, we've got to get ready for a Trump world. But the next step is to be clever and smart enough to know how to manage a Trump world.
And I think that's going to be very interesting to be in a Trump world, but to also experience those conflicts of interest on conflict of interest, because it seems like it's going to keep cropping up. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a very insightful discussion.
Thank you for having us.
Very insightful indeed. And we look forward to the first 100 days of the Trump era, and I'm sure the discussion will be
We'll definitely have you back here at the end of that 100 days.
This story is not going away.
It's not going away for the next 4 years. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Those were Professor Raymond Parsons from the Northwest University and Tinashe Chuchu from Wits University joining us live for that massive Donald Trump discussion.
Well, that's it for now. Thank you for being with us. We'll be back after this short break.